Intergovernmental Legislative Relations Committee. We do have a quorum. The first item on the agenda is review of ordinance amendments, and I'm going to turn it over to Tom to discuss because
sure
they can't talk.
Okay, thank you, Councilor. Thank you for making it. Jeff, if you could go ahead and share screen with the write-up, and we'll get that up and bring up the ordinance. And while Jeff's doing that, real simply, over the last 4 or 5 months, the IGR has kind of asked to take a look at kind of amending and updating the IGR ordinance because things are a little bit more complex now with capital outlay being a bigger thing, more serious issues going through the legislature for policy, and with congressional earmarks back, of course, all that goes on with the federal government. So we are just trying to update it. And Jeff, you could scroll down a little bit to the next one. So what it did was myself and Libby and I met, and we did some amendments based on what we'd received. And Jeff, you can continue to scroll down till you show the text. Thanks. If you could on that one there. So we had received some, we took the feedback we had received from the IGR, from the committee. We then wrote it in, and then I believe I sent out the drafts to the counselors at least. I hope I did to lobbyists also, but no, at least the counselors. And then Libby brought it back up to the mayor's office for staff there to review. They made some changes. We came back down and we made some additional changes. So what the changes primarily cover are fairly simple. It's basically just some paperwork, some administrative work, just authorizes there to be alternates for the IGR. As these meetings are becoming a little bit more frequent, a little bit more important, we thought it's important that the counselors, if they can't make it, to be able to appoint an alternate. And I think, and the same thing for the administration, although the administration, because they were just kind of pointing people at the mayor's direction, had been able to basically send alternates, but the counselors hadn't really been able to do that yet. So we hope we can add that in. It's just kind of does another paperwork issue that the mayor shall appoint the IGR members from the administration side. Adds that the IGR is supposed to be a coordinating committee with other intergovernmental units. So the MRGCD was not in there. We figured that now as water becomes more important and their role with recreation on the ditches and open space in the bosque, that they were in the role of the bosque, it would probably be good to have them in there. Then I think the big issues that the issues of meat that the counselors were wishing to address were establishes October 31st as a deadline for adopting the state legislative priorities. That could have been a little earlier. We decided to kind of present that to the committee because it does usually take counselors a little bit of time to kind of figure out their priorities, because it's kind of hard for them to focus on it too early before the legislative session. So we felt that by having them start working on it in September, that would probably be about the earliest we could get them to get going. Most of the counselors, the administration's a little bit easier because basically upon direction from the CAO or the mayor, they have to begin assembling their priorities. Requires the state resolution be submitted to both the state legislature and the governor's office. Again, kind of a administrative detail. Establishes that the federal resolution upon being established will be sent to the congressional delegation and then any relevant agencies. And that's if there's a particular priority that the counselor or the mayor are working with, or the city's working with the federal lobbyist with a particular agency, that the lobbyist can get that up to that agency. Then also is number 7. Number 7 is a little different. That is establishes procedures for amending the list of priorities after the resolution has been adopted. One of the issues is that once we adopt the resolution, a lot of things happen quickly. And so basically priorities can get added on, particularly at the administration level, because they're hearing a lot of critical stuff or critical information. And once it gets there, but sometimes that doesn't get filtered down to the council. So basically you can end up in the legislature with not all the parties that are up there representing the city knowing fully what our priorities are. So what we tried to do was develop a system where you could either amend it by sending a resolution back to the council if there's time for adoption to amend it in, or B, the city, and this is the same with the federal level too, the council, the mayor and the council president could both sign a joint letter. So they could both come together and say, yeah, let's add that on. They could sign a joint letter, send it up to Mr. Thompson to distribute to who he distributes up to at the state level, or Mr. O'Donnell to who he distributes up to in Washington. and then just send copies down to the remaining counselors and the department directors who need to be notified. So that would be that method. That's option A. We then had an option B, and the option B had to do with, I think, the one area where the administration and the counselors on the IGR didn't quite fully and come to consensus yet. And that was whether or not there should be a maximum number of priorities. So option A just adds in that the IGR may establish an option number of priorities kind of based on category, or by geography, if they want to do it by amount per district, or by category, if they feel like, for instance, there's a big demand for social services. So this year, we'll probably just kind of maximize the number of social service requests. That way we can focus on our most needed ones, something like that. The administration kind of felt like, no, that as priorities came in fairly quickly, and I can't quite remember why, but Mr. Rael had some concerns that a lot could happen, even happens during the legislature, and that we needed some ability to add things on quickly. Or I think basically, depending on the year, I'm not quite sure, he's not here today, what his concerns were, but maybe somebody from administration side could explain those. But I think he was concerning that it would limit flexibility to address the situation as it evolves. That basically, as the legislature comes into session, particularly legislature, people who had interest suddenly could now just show up on the city's doorstep saying, oh, I've had this interest all along, I'd like to add it in. And I think he's wanting not to lose that flexibility if it's particularly a good interest. So I think that was kind of it. So option B includes the priorities, a maximum number of priorities. Option A doesn't, assuming knowing that there's still that discrepancy. Of course, today, Mr. Rael is not in attendance, although maybe Mr. Pooley or Ms. Sandoval might be able to speak for him on that one there. So that's basically kind of a rundown of what we have. Again, this is just the discussion draft. So we assume there'll be a number this is an ordinance that will go, number of drafts will go forward with continuing amendments. And so with that, Madam Chair, I defer back to you.
Thank you, Mr. Minicucci. Mr. Thompson?
Yes, thank you very much, Madam Chair. I'm sorry you're not feeling well. I think I can talk a little bit about the flexibility that Mr. Rael mentioned. As legislators, we'll have some legislators in Santa Fe who they weren't a legislator. They never thought about any of this until the day they're really sworn in, which is that third Tuesday in January. And so I would agree that to the degree that we can create some level of flexibility, because that's when, those first weeks of the legislature, sometimes you'll have some interesting opportunities be created. And I'll leave it at that.
Thank you. Councilor Mazan?
Madam Chair, as much as I think flexibility is important, I also agree with that. I worry about having a maximum number because, as evidenced even by last year, that what we thought was going to be the agreed upon list, we were in the end like, oh, well, there's a whole bunch more that ended up getting presented to the legislature. And so I think that having a maximum is going to just end up being something we regret, in my opinion, although I think that we should have the intention of, having a priority list, but also making sure that we have a deadline to say, this year, our priorities really do need to be submitted by a specific date, and we should really refrain from last minute additions, because if it's a priority, sure, things come up, but there's a lot of projects that have been in the works for a while, and we recognize that. And so if they're important, we need to make sure to lobby for them as well, but without just letting something come up at the last minute and essentially cherry pick the process.
Thank you, Councilor. Mr. Pulley?
Madam Chair, I just wanted to echo some of the comments already made, that can fully agree that the more we can prioritize, it's more effective. But when we are trying to be good partners with our state legislative, representatives and senators, sometimes there are things that shift between when we make our decisions and the trajectory of what's going on at the Capitol. So I would just want to echo perhaps what Mr. Rael might say if he was able to join us today, is that an arbitrary cap might just at times get in the way of us working with those up there who are trying to help Albuquerque and help us. And when things come up, we may have to shift priorities and fully understand that everything can't be a priority. But I do think that it could be problematic to put in an arbitrary specific cap.
Thank you. Councilor Mazan?
Thank you, Madam Chair. Just to go back. Oh, wrong button. Part of what I remember last year, I think I was really surprised, and I know we've talked about this before, but I think it's worth bringing up again, that we had come up with a recommended list of priorities on this committee that got passed through the council, that was including the administration, and suddenly, between what we had proposed to the state that was agreed upon and approved, all of a sudden there was kind of, from my perspective, a very large surprise package of new priorities that was submitted on behalf of the city without council approval or knowledge on a lot of it. And even though I know that there's things that come up, I was thinking that this process that we're going through now is trying to work together to truly agree that if we actually have a priorities list that we finalize together, that one or the other of the entities in Albuquerque are not blindsided by some surprise document when we actually go up and hear from the legislators.
Yeah, I'll agree with Councilor Bassan. It was my first year this year, and I was really shocked at the way the process works. So I am glad that we're working through this and thinking of a better way to develop this. And I will just say, and I'm not going to speak for Councilor Pena, but she has in the past said several times that she also has concerns about a cap. And so I just want to make sure we get that on record, that we're hearing a lot of folks that say the cap might not be the best way to do it, but perhaps, not a legal cap, but a coming together and a determining of, an ideal number of priorities might be good. And Councilor Pena's on, so I don't need to speak for her. Mr. O'Donnell.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. Can somebody tell me roughly how many projects or capital outlay requests you had at the Santa Fe last year? The reason I ask is I'm trying to compare that number to what we have as earmark requests at the federal level.
Madam Chair, I saw about 300 different ones.
But,
okay.
Madam Chair.
Joe, thank you for that.
Now, some of those are not City of Albuquerque, like they want City of Albuquerque to be the fiscal agent, or some of them are, they don't come from us.
Yeah.
And so that's why it's so confusing. And I would agree, there were projects that showed up late in the process that were totally unexpected, and it just sort of gunked up our messaging a little bit. That's all. And it was confusing. So I like the idea of us at least going in, having an idea of what our universe looks like as it all relates to us, recognizing that perhaps something will spring up from the community, or something will spring up from a legislator, or from some collaboration between the city and the state, or somebody that might create this need for flexibility.
Councilor Bassan.
Madam Chair, thank you. So I think that Mr. Menicucci, you would probably be the quickest person to be able to give us kind of the summary, because again, Mr. O'Donnell, there were two lists essentially last year that I remember. There was the one that was approved by IGR and council, and we all went through this process. It was very limited in the quantity of projects that went to Santa Fe. It was not 300. But then I do recall legislators calling me, and the administration had brought up a 87 something page book of priorities that included new things that we were unaware of. And so that's where, to me, maybe, is there a way for us to, when we agree on whatever priorities we decide on, whether there's a maximum or not, there's almost a way to say, almost like, I'm picturing like a trademark, right? These have been stamped and approved by the city of Albuquerque, from all the way from the mayor's office to the city council. These are agreed upon. And then all these others that come in, perhaps they're important, but they're like almost some kind of noticeable stamp of approval for when we actually send these up to say, well, sure, this one's because we need to be a fiscal agent, and somebody else put that in there. But that way there's maybe something more, I don't even know if that's a possibility, but to me, I think it would behoove us to be able to have something that, if we were able to make it very clear that these are rubber stamped and ready to rock from everybody's perspective when it comes to Albuquerque. And then they're also important for whatever those reasons are, but you legislators, you take it upon yourself to decide if they need to be lumped in there.
So, Madam Chair, Councilor Bassan, I think, yes, there's two potential ways. Mr. Thompson, though, I think I'll defer to him if he thinks these would work. One of them is, first of all, is that in the whereas clauses of the resolution, what you just described, we could put that in the whereas. So that it's formal adopted by the city. These are the formal priorities with all their importance. Then state forward, which we kind of state, but make it clear. Then state forward. Other issues will come up, and sure, they have importance, but these are the first and foremost, and however we want to put that language. So that's one method. Second L is that, as you know, as the booklet's prepared by the administration, we could have a cover letter. And the cover letter could either be signed by both the mayor and the president of the council or by the members of the IGR, whichever y'all decide on, that could go in there. So basically the legislatures have two written messages coming to them besides any information Mr. Thompson or the staff that goes up to Santa Fe from both the administration and the council or your staff can pass forward. So that's one method. If Madam Chair, if time allows, I could defer to Mr. Thompson if he thinks that would have some effectiveness.
Yeah, thank you very much, Madam Chair, Mr. Menicucci. Let's look at it maybe a slightly different way. Sometimes we might want to identify a project that's not quite ready to be funded, right? But we want to put it on the screen, and there could be a political reason to do that. There could be a constituent reason to do that. There's a variety of reasons why it's good policy to have the funders see those projects, but it shouldn't be at the front burner. And the hard part for us as the staff that are on the ground is we get in there and we don't have a lot of time, right? So someone's going to go, should I do this park, that park, this council project, Gateway Center? And we try to encourage them to make the decisions they want to make and make sure that money's not wasted. Those are really our guiding principles. So it's to the degree there's clarity, it's always good for us, recognizing that there's a million different reasons to put a project up for consideration. I do like what Tom is saying about trying to find some way that gives a little bit of guidance for us to rely upon.
Okay, I'm hearing pretty universal agreement. I think we need to decide on between Tom's two suggestions, right? So we should put it in the whereas clauses, or we could do a cover letter. But I do completely agree with Councilor Bassan that we have to somehow identify city of Albuquerque priorities so that no one is shocked when a legislator calls them. It's not a fun place to be. Councilor Bassan was there with me this year and it was painful. So I guess I would have a slight preference for the cover letter that Mr. Menicucci talked about. I also think that option A has that flexibility. We can re-look at these priorities as time goes by and change them if needed, but it gives us a framework for identifying those city priorities. Councilor Bassan.
Madam Chair, if possible, I'm a fan of even saying both. Why can't we put it in the whereas? And then also if there's a booklet that goes out, it kind of has a little bit of brief guidance as well. And then while I'm speaking, I'll say that I prefer option A.
That's a great point, Councilor. I don't know why we couldn't do both. Seems to make a lot of sense to me. Councilor Pena.
Thank you, Madam Chair. We're not actually voting on this today, though, correct?
I don't think we are, Tom. Are we?
No, ma'am, this
Okay.
is the first discussion item. Although if you all agree today, we could prepare a draft for your approval for the next meeting.
I would say, Councilor, oh, I'm sorry, go ahead.
Oh, I'm sorry, Madam Chair. I was just going to say that, it's just so difficult, and, going up to Santa Fe for so many years and knowing how the process works, I don't think we're ever going to be able to come out with a perfect process, but, I would, as long as we're not voting on it today, I would be leaning more towards the option A. We did have a list of priorities that we chose as a city last year, and I know there was some additional items added for whatever reason, whether they became priority, whether a legislator said, hey, make this a city priority because I want to fund this and I'm not going to fund anything else. every year that I've gone down there, there always tends to be some confusion. I think this year, I think as I stated that last meeting, is that I think where the confusion is coming in these past couple of years more so is that we're all trying to transition to this online process, right? And I know some of the legislators had some difficulty in terms of knowing what the process is, because before they would be given a book and it had the list of things that were in their district, and now it's just kind of online and they have to go look for it. I think they're fine-tuning their process over there, is my understanding. And as we move forward, you know, I think we kind of just continue on the path that we have, and we have our priorities. Again, like I say, the mayor added some additional priorities there at the end, which makes it very uncomfortable for all of us. But I think, you know, us meeting more frequently, all of us being on the same page in terms of what, you know, as long as we know the administration added these new items, we can have those conversations. Where I would be more inclined is just to make sure that it's between the city council and the administration. I know we had a couple of departments that went in and put in their own legislative requests. And I think that really kind of threw things out of whack, right? Because, you know, we are the policy body of the city of Albuquerque. So, you know, as the department directors, I would encourage them to meet with the councilors, meet with the mayor ahead of time, and let us know, and we'll be able to give the consideration to add those items into requests. And as for nonprofit and neighborhood associations, I think that's going to continue unless they ever make that kind of, you know, put in an ordinance that can happen. But like I had mentioned at last meeting as well, you know, being a community advocate, and we needed a shade structure at Alamosa Park. You just write it. You can go, you know, everybody has the ability to write it up and go online and submit it. So, you know, we have to make sure that that the legislators know that when we pass that legislation that we pass every year, that those are you know, our agreement as a body and with the administration, those are our priorities. And if there's anything else added, we're going to have to really make sure that everyone's aware of it. And if it is something that's important to all of us, then we can, you know, all speak out of the same sheet of music instead of some of what occurred last year.
Thank you,
Thank you,
Councilor.
Madam Chair.
So any other comments on this? If not, I would say I haven't heard any preference for option B. So I'm just wondering if the committee would like Mr. Minicucci to move forward with drafting up option A for us to consider the next meeting. I'm seeing heads shaking. I'm not seeing any heads going the other way. Okay, so if that's okay with you, Mr. Minicucci, I think that would be a good idea. I think I've heard pretty universal agreement on this. Okay, let's move on to, to item B, discuss planning for establishing the upcoming federal and state priorities. And I'll turn it back over to Mr. Minicucci.
Madam Chair, so of course, basically, as the committee has this year decided to get going a little bit early to get going earlier than usual with the getting the federal and state priorities. This was upon consultation with Mr. Thompson and Mr. O'Donnell, who had recommended that. And I think Mr. Padilla also at the time recommended it, and along with the members of the IGR. So what we are, so basically, we would like to go ahead and ask the IGR if one, would they like us to go ahead with a formal call to, I gather the Mr. I'm not quite sure who would do it in administration, Ms. Anaya or Mr. Griego and Ms. Dolan, if they'd go forward with the administration to the departments. And then in the city, myself and Mr. Hertz would contact the remaining counselors to notify them to please start preparing their capital outlay. One of the reasons I think, and I believe it may have been Councilor Fiebelkorn, I hope I'm not incorrect, I'm putting you in the wrong, misquoting you correctly. I think you, and I think somebody from administration, I'm not quite sure, may have been Mr. Padilla or Mr. Pooley, had mentioned that number of agencies are now getting their applications in, or Mr. Thompson may have said it, very early anymore. That's a new trend, and that we need to kind of be much more ahead of the game than we've been. So that's one of the reasons for doing this. So that would be a call into it. We do not yet have a final, I think our date is still for the legislature, is still like December. So I think the question to you all is, do you as a committee, would you like to establish an earlier date that you would like to have priorities in front of your committee? Do you want them by October or September? What do you think you would like them in front of, or November? That's question one. And then I think that's the first question. And the second group would be in the, if you look online at Mr. Hertz, Jeff, if you could bring up the, reshare the screen again. Thanks.
You would like for me to share your write-up?
No. Yeah, share the write-up. Yes.
Okay.
I think there are a number of issues. There's a couple of issues that they had to work through. And if you could bring that up, well, I can start with it. So one of them was coordinating. I think the biggest one was being able to coordinate priority requests between the administration and the council, so as not to make duplicate asks. And the issue there is that it would require, to make that work, we've tried several ways, but to make it work, that there'd have to be a share file, most likely managed by the CIP group, unless the mayor's office has a group they want to manage it, that the council policy analysts and the mayor's office and the CIP group could access to see what forms capital outlay requests have been prepared and submitted. So I think that would be it. So people have to have access to that. Last year, I think there was some concern from the mayor's office. I think that they didn't quite feel comfortable doing that. I think that was something I believe they have yet since worked out. So just make sure that there is agreement that there would be that shared document. I think limiting number of priorities, I think that one's a go. That's a let that one loose now. Number two, that I think was discussed not to go that way. And then of course, I think just a proposal that Mr. Thompson had brought 3 or 4 years earlier that seems to have worked well. And the Keller administration, when they came in, they also implemented it. And that is that one, submitting projects that are the type that the legislatures and the congressional delegation prioritize for funding. So making sure we're on the same page with them. And then structuring the funding so that it works with their plan of action. And basically that's kind of like saying, does it coordinate with their goals as the previous request? And also they like to see, is there funding that we're having to leverage it? And is there seem to be a definite kind of end date as to when we can get the funding and see some implementation happen? We've tried to move more and more towards that, the city has. And it seems to have, my understanding, has gone well with the legislature. So, but last year, I think this goes back to what Councilor Pena mentioned, is that a few departments submitted requests that no one knew about. And one of the issues with those requests is that many of those requests, I think there was a significant, particularly one department, a massive amount in the tens of millions of dollars of requests for funding. And oftentimes the projects were just to fund the full project. So it was kind of not the working solution. And what ended up with is this year, the legislatures went ahead and funded a large amount of those projects from that department, but only in very small amounts. So now that leaves the city, or at least the administration, and particularly the new chief operations officers, with the predicament of how to get that money spent, figuring out which of that money do you spend this year on some small part. For instance, if it was a park project to rebuild a park, at least trying to get a few picnic tables purchased so that the legislators feel like their money went to good use, or which ones do you go back to the legislatures and say, this is going to take 5-6 years to fund. Would you be willing to hang in there with us? But that's a position we didn't really want to be in. So I think trying to make sure that doesn't happen again this year. So that's kind of the briefing on, what, if we can get a timeline as to when you want all the requests to come to. If you do want to issue a formal call, would be 2 or 1 and then 2, and then 3 would be just kind of making sure those challenges that we hit last year are being addressed. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you. Any comments on this? Councilor Bassan.
Madam Chair, I think, and I would like hopefully Mr. O'Donnell to confirm this, I think that we kind of ironed out a lot of that as far as, following through with prioritizing projects that we know that the delegation up in Washington wants. So really, we're needing to really fine tune some of here in the state, correct?
Madam Chairman, is Councilor Bassan asking me to comment on that?
Please do.
Okay.
Madam Chair, Mr. O'Donnell, I feel like we're doing a pretty good job of making sure that we prioritize things that are relevant as far as earmarks and whatnot when it comes to Washington. Am I correct?
Yes, Councilor. I think what we've established in the past 2 years, this process, there's a gateway for projects to be vetted. And I would say an example of that, and it's going in the direction of more projects, is in a year ago in 2021, we had about 10 projects total submitted for congressional earmarks. This year we had 16, but to a point that's been made before by Mr. Thompson and Mr. Menicucci, we also had the congressional delegation add in a couple of projects. But I think what has helped at the federal level is that there are federal program eligibility requirements you have to meet. Then there is the amount of money you're asking for, the project readiness for performing either construction or to put the program, if it's a services program, implementing it. And I think that's helped us sort through the projects.
Madam Chair. Thank you. So thank you, Mr. O'Donnell. And so I wanted to make sure that I recognize that we have two very different and yet super important situations that we're dealing with when we talk about IGR. So I'm glad to hear that on the federal level, we kind of are checking that box. So then I guess my question to Mr. Thompson is, when it comes to timeline for both of these, when we're talking federal or just for Albuquerque and the state, I'm wondering, really, do we need to bump up any kind of timeline, and what would you recommend? Because I feel like we get to a certain point where we want to add in a specific time frame saying, oh, let's get earlier and earlier and earlier until all of a sudden we're planning for 3 years from now, and really that's irrelevant. So I would like, from my perspective, to rely on, Mr. Thompson, Mr. O'Donnell, when it comes to should we set a different timeline, whether it's October, November, whatever, is that recommended to be beneficial? Because that's, to me, the better way for us to navigate through the recommendation.
Madam Chair and Councilor Bassan, I definitely think it's to our advantage to move up the timeline. I mean, if you just look in the last couple of years, in the old days, there was no uploading of requests, right? We would walk around with paper and they'd sign it the first week. Well, it's got to be uploaded now a week before the session even begins. And the thing that we learned the hard way is that you really have to have your sponsors identified before you upload it. Otherwise, you're asking them to pull the projects into their universes, and everybody's asking them, and there's no formal process. And if they forget, and so we were running around, we asked one legislator to take every single city of Albuquerque project and pull it into her universe, just so it had some sponsor. And so I think we need to move it up quickly. Now, the challenge of that is that it's going to force us to make decisions probably before they're truly ripe from a priority standpoint. I get that. And it's also going to require probably us getting in touch with legislators much sooner. And when you're going to have a new legislator, you might even have a new legislator once the year starts. There's challenges there, but I think we've got to try and reconcile those challenges. Otherwise, we are only going to fall further behind. And I appreciate what Mr. O'Donnell's saying as it relates to the planning and the evaluating of projects, because like Councilor Bassan, you have a perfect project that has been going for years, right? It's been planned, it's been phased, it's ready for prime time. Not all projects are ready for prime time. And so legislators are expecting us to go to them and say, this is where this project is in our process. This is how much city money we have. This is federal money. These are other funds. And when we're telling them that story, they appreciate the planning and phasing that's gone into it. So that's something they're only becoming more and more stressed about when we don't have that information.
So Madam Chair, if I may respond to that too. Thank you. So I guess two things about that. I have two questions, I guess. One is then if we're going to pre-plan, which I'm a planner, I don't like spontaneity, so I'm all for this. But, if we're going to be doing this, is there a recommended date that we should maybe not box us into a hard room and a hard, corner to say we need to do this by a certain date, but that we need to maybe aspire to it, or so I would like to know, is October, December, November, what is a good time frame to look for that? And then my second question is, if everything is working so well on the federal level with the parameters that are being set, is there a way, and should we consider mimicking that here?
So, Madam Chair, Madam President, or Chair, I don't know what the answer is on the timeline. You know, the state budgets are due to LFC on September 1. That's when they've the executive agencies have to have their picks in. But I don't have, that's above my pay grade. And then as far as the feds go, I don't know. I mean, I try and get money for the feds on other projects, and it's a Byzantine process to me. So I'm not a good evaluator of that either. I'm sorry.
Okay, and one more thing, Madam Chair, then, so if I guess I don't know the timeline, if we should do October or whatever. Mr. Minicucci, if you have a recommendation, that'd be great. But I guess when I'm talking, you scare me when you say Byzantine though, so I'm not real excited about taking that on either. But at the same time, perhaps if there's a way for us to kind of structure how we prioritize, level, like, I don't know, have a 1 through 5 scale of this project is brand new, this project's, you know, midway, whatever it is. I don't know if that's, and again, I'm just kind of spitballing and brainstorming if there's a way for us to figure out some kind of scoring system, if that would be better, or if I'm just wasting more time by even suggesting it.
Madam Chairman,
Yeah, Mr. O'Donnell.
about the timing, I would say this. I think I read in the report, in the memorandum, that maybe we should start the state and the federal in August. I may have that incorrect, but I think that's what I read. And I don't know if August is the right time, because it's August, the dog days. But I do think, as far as the federal side goes, we need to have what I would describe as an official kickoff. And that might mean us visiting with the IGR, with the mayor's office, with the council office, about what do the projects look like for this coming year? Because I think what's happened to us the past 2 years is that we spend some time in November and December collecting lists, and it got better this year, but I think we could start that process earlier. And I like what I heard before about the flexibility in the process, because what we look at in October, November may not be the same list you're going to see with the best opportunity to move forward in January and February. But I think there's a lot of discussion that we can have if we've got the framework of the IGR to work within. And that's what I think has helped us at the federal level do this. So I would say, I think from our vantage point, we ought to start the formal process at least in September. And I think it ought to be done with us meeting with folks in Albuquerque to start the discussion of what projects look like. And that's an opportunity to talk about, okay, what was funded in FY 23 by the delegation? What did that list look like? I mean, the program areas, not the specific projects necessarily. The other thing I would say too, and this is something that I've said this before in these meetings, earmarks have sort of brought your federal program into these virtual and real meetings with the IGR. When it's just grants, there isn't this same dynamic at work in terms of building a list. And our list has not really included at the federal level, as I believe I've heard Mr. Thompson speak about it in Santa Fe with the legislature. We don't really identify legislative issues. Now, I realize that I don't want to open Pandora's box here and then regret what I've said, but I would say that we've not listed specific legislative things that could be of interest. And I'll just pick one as an aside here, like the CHIPS Act that is going to be signed by the administration very quickly. that, you know, gives subsidies to the folks that are building chips. And because you have a big facility there in New Mexico, I mean, I'm sure that they're interested in this, but that's something we might have identified, although our congressional delegation, because of their work with folks in New Mexico, are very well informed on that. But I just say we might want to look at legislative issues as well as earmarks, because frankly, the earmarks are driving your federal program.
Good point, Mr. O'Donnell. Mr. Pulley?
Madam Chair, just a few quick points. Thank you for all the discussion, and just to note a couple things. One, as far as folks talking about, more communication and starting earlier, really can't argue against that at all, meaning that's always helpful. So if we need to meet earlier and talk about some of these things, I think that would be great. However, a couple things that have come up, I just want to note from the administrative side. Hopefully we succeed in getting all this money and then we spend it. Because one of the success factors, as we all know, in getting it is getting it spent. So as far as shared documents or the repository of where this information is, I just want to make a pitch that keeping those lists on the administrative side so that we can carry them all the way through from requests to tracking to getting it to spending it and closing it out, I still think is, in my opinion, better as an executive function, even if we're sharing that information along the way. But as far as managing lists, I just feel like that maybe belongs, in my opinion, more on the administrative executive side. Another point, because a lot's been said, as far as the federal and state, if there's things in our process that can help the other process work better, that's great. But in my opinion, the fiscal years are different, the cycles are different, the process is different. I just personally view like the federal process and the state process having a very, very different rhythm. So, to the extent that we start both earlier and get on the right cycle to start earlier for each, but I don't personally see how we can, parallel the federal and the state that much, in my opinion. And I really want to defer to the lobbyists at both levels if anything I say is, doesn't resonate. But just want to note one more thing. After that 11-year hiatus, like we're just back to the federal game. So I know there's more to learn, and I think that process might shake out a little differently too. But I just wanted to weigh in with I think we're ready to talk more frequently and ready to talk earlier. But it still would make it a little bit easier on our side if we were tracking the information in a central way.
Thank you, Mr. Pulley. Any other, I don't see any other hands up.
Madam Chair, I apologize, Mike.
Yeah, Mr. McEntee.
But just real quickly to respond to Councilor Hassan's question as to when's a good timeline? I think I can only give you the perspective from council staff watching the councilors. Probably would be the timeline we think to work best for you would be to get the priorities adopted in time so that you as councilors, and again, wherever the administration they have to lobby to, have the appropriate amount of time before the session to lobby and to work with their legislatures, and that being multiple legislators. So, I mean, you kind of know when you have to set up schedule appointments with legislators, what's their availability as you get closer to the session. And do you need to have this thing in your hands by December, by November? I think what do you think from your all's experience? I think particularly, Councilor Penny has done it for many years now, and Councilor Bassan, Councilor Fiefkorn, who works legislature, and I think the people from administration. How many months ahead of time or weeks do you need it before the session starts to have the time to spend with the legislators?
Madam Chair, can you hear me? This is Lawrence.
Yeah, go ahead, Mr. Ryle.
Thank you very much. I apologize for not being there, but I've been listening to the conversation. May I make one suggestion? I think we're sort of putting a round peg in a square hole. And here's my thought. My thought is, I think we got to separate the state legislative process from the federal process in terms of the timing. I think Mike put the issue pretty clearly. The federal process, I think, gives us a different clock. And the state legislative process is much more interactive with us on day-by-day basis, whether it's councilors talking to legislators or the mayor or any of us in the executive side. So we might want to think about maybe doing the legislative piece first, the state legislative piece, and then using what John just said, let's have the conversation going on the federal piece, but then maybe decide that the federal piece needs to be solidified in maybe January, February timeline, whereas the state piece might need to be certified, i.e. approved in the October, November timeline. That way we don't get ourselves too confused. The state stuff is much more dynamic, and there's so many folks that weigh in to include, and I know that John will Mr. Thompson will tell us, Joe will tell us that, look, we have legislators that ask for requests on the day of the introduction of the bill that you and I or any other councilor, including the mayor, may not know about. And we get a call from Joe at the last minute, hey, will you support this? So I think as much as we try and hone that process in, it's going to be pretty dynamic, but I do think that the federal process is a little bit more structured. And so that would be my thought, is separating the two so that we don't get ourselves too confused.
Thank you, Mr. Rayo. Councilor Bassan.
Madam Chair, I agree with a lot of what Mr. Rao was saying, and I definitely didn't mean to hopefully imply earlier even that I wanted them to be married up together too much or at all. I do want to ask for clarification though, and I realize, but Mr. O'Donnell said September is good for federal, and I want to make sure that I heard that right, rather than January. It was my understanding that September, so I realize that legislatively, we might not even have time to do all of that when it comes to getting things through council and with all the other IGR meetings in the process. But if that is the goal, I mean, I just want to make sure. Did you say September is really kind of like ideally federally what we should shoot for?
Madam Chairman, Councilor Bassan, when I said September, my thought was that's a good time to begin to start a conversation with the administration and councilors about IGR, about what does the project list look like? What legislative items do you think? Or we bring the legislative items to you, a menu, and say, these are the things we believe will be coming up. Let's discuss those. I do think what Mr. Real said about not trying to, and I think Mr. Pooley said this too, I don't think we need to make the two efforts synchronized, but I do think that we need to be ready with a list of legislative and project priorities in January. What happens with the delegation is they start reaching out for projects in February, and believe me, their process is pretty swift. It's not always streamlined, as Tom Manicucci and Greg Seeley can attest to. But I think if we start the thing formally, and by formally I just mean let's have a kickoff in September or October, but let's work towards having a list by, I would hope, by the end of December. So in January, you can approve some kind of a resolution and we've got something that we're working with.
Madam Chair.
Go ahead, Councilor.
Thank you. I really like the idea. Well, first of all, I love menus, so that's awesome. I like the idea of a menu coming to us because, and I think that so I'm glad we clarified that because I wasn't all the way clear on it. So I like the idea of getting a menu. I also think that, to me, from what I've experienced on a federal level, there are certain parameters when it comes to earmarks where, I mean, we had projects that we wanted to include, but really they didn't fit in whatever bucket the delegation was looking for. So we got to take those out, and then we were able to kind of fine tune it in that way. So I do like the idea of kind of having the recommended list, because I also think that it is easier, or maybe I hate to say simplified list when it comes to the federal level, but really it's not 300 different projects. We're not talking about all the little things, and that we go for some of the bigger long-term or more significant things when we go to the federal level when it comes to that. So I'm glad to clarify, and I'm on board.
Thank you, Counselor.
Madam Chair, this is Lawrence again. So may I make the recommendation to the staff that, and see if you all like this idea, that by January 15th, we'll have the federal priorities approved and done. If they want to move that clock up by 15 days, that's fine, but by January. And that for the state legislative priorities, that we should at least have a general consensus that we should have our project lists at least by the end of October, if not earlier. And I'm not going to qualm about what days, but I think if we get too early on the state stuff, it's you know, by the time especially on an election year, when you have an election happening, and keep in mind this year is the unique one because we don't have one, but next year you're going to have 5 city councils up for re-election. And so that becomes even more challenging as it relates to prioritization of projects. But anyway, we should shoot, in my opinion, for October for the state and January for the feds.
Thank you, Mr. Rael. I agree with that. I would just add that I think we should send out the call for state later this month and the call for federal next month, and then have state priorities, at least the original listing, by the end of October. And then I think your January 15th deadline for federal works really well. Is that okay with you?
Madam Chair, I'm good with that.
Okay.
Madam Chair, just a quick clarification. Would that be to have them adopted by the council or to have them in front of the IGR for a recommendation to the council? I mean, I'm assuming January 15th is adopted by the council and October 30th is adoption by the council for the state, or?
That would be my request. I think that as counselors and the mayor's office, we need a couple of months to work legislators. And Joe shaking his head, he can tell you, getting appointments in November and December is difficult, but we really do need to be reaching out to folks at the end of the year. I don't want to wait until, the session's starting. So that would be my suggestion.
Madam Chair, I would agree with what you said. The timing for council members and the administration to be reaching out to the delegation, if you're going to have an adoption by January 15th, and we're working starting in September on what that federal program looks like, you would have time in that November, December timeframe to have some probably one-on-one or discussions with the congressional delegation over that holiday period about specific things that are important in this list of priorities. And I would also want to add something, and I think it's implicit in a lot of what Mr. Thompson has said, and you folks are already doing with your state legislators. I would encourage you to have delegation staff come and see your projects.
Very good point. Yes. Okay, so I think we had agreement, Mr. Minicucci. Do you need any further direction?
No, I don't. I think we do. And just, I think, to kind of follow up with Mr. Pooley, yes. Mr. Pooley, that the shared list, I think you're right. What was worked out, I think Mr. Padilla, a couple months ago, was that the shared list would be developed by the CIP group. I didn't make that clear, so thank you for clarifying that. Mr. Motzko and Mr. Madden. So that way, I think, and yeah, I mean, the administration people, correct me if I'm wrong. The idea was that the list of tracking money for a project would start from when it's first conceived to all the way when the last check goes out to a contractor, would stay with the same group. So if that's
Thank you.
Thank you, Madam Chair.
Sure. Okay. Any other comments on this? I see no hands. So let's move on to the last discussion item, which is I believe it was Mr. Rael's item, and it's the independent government units participation in development of City of Albuquerque infrastructure. I don't know if Mr. Rael wants to speak on this, or Tom.
Madam Chair, I can defer to Mr. Rael. It's a request he brought up to us, to council staff, when we were in CIP Executive Committee, just kind of regarding quickly, independent governments don't have to come to city for a review. on their infrastructure. And so when they link into city services, which they need, you can create some conflicts. And Mr. Real, I think, wanted to discuss it because there is one potentially occurring with UNM and the UNMH hospital. So thank you.
Madam Chair and members of the council, I hope you guys can hear me, of the IGR. I think the only issue I have a concern with is when we have, as you know, we have different jurisdictions in the city limits that don't have to go through our process for planning and design of any projects. So when you have the University of New Mexico, for example, or the Albuquerque Public Schools, another example, or even Bernalillo County, all of these independent units of government don't necessarily have to coordinate with us, yet their projects impact how we operate and manage, for example, our simple things like our roadway system or our parks, or quite frankly, how they impact our transit system. And so I'm just a little bit concerned about how we manage those and how we end up basically trying to work the impact of those projects. And the one that's clearly in our mind is the University Hospital and the infrastructure that's being built next to Lomas Boulevard and University Boulevard. That is going to become a huge traffic issue for us at the city. And yet there's been no discussion about the site itself, because they don't have to go through our planning process or any way of how they structure those facilities. And I just want to make sure that we all sort of have a sensitivity to that. Years ago, we had the same issues with APS when they were citing public schools on facilities that didn't have enough capacity to take care of the impacts of the school. So those are just issues that we ought to have more conversation about. And maybe we use the Intergovernmental Committee where many of them are on the committee to talk about them, but they do have impacts on our city.
Thank you, Mr. Ayel. I had a question about this, and it's taking it a little bit further, but I also have a concern about these kind of projects in the city of Albuquerque not having to meet our building codes, our energy codes, any of those types of things. And that, of course, has massive implications for other types of infrastructure. So I don't know the answer, but I just wanted to throw out that it's a little broader than just roads and transportation, I think.
Madam Chair, there's no question, and members of the committee, there's no question that those are obviously the more long-term impacts as well. But, you know, because they are state entities created wholly unto themselves. I don't know if there's some machination that we might be able to do with the legislature or with them individually to try and figure out how we coordinate our projects. And I don't think we have an answer today, but I did want to just put it on the table for our conversation and discussion as we move forward.
Thank you for bringing that issue up. I think it's a big one. Any questions, comments? Any other business? Okay, well, with that, I think I will adjourn this meeting and I will see you all next month.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.